views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Hello, welcome to the Social Justice Forums. I am Darren Jaime. We thank you for joining us. If you're asking the question, what is the Social Justice Forum about? Well, we're a show that talks about a lot of the inequities that people face. We promote civic conversation. We invite you to be a part of the dialogue, and we try to elevate the conversation. So we encourage you to stay with us. We've got a very special show as the Social Justice Forums begins right now. And welcome back to the show. Looking at recent figures, according to the U.S. Small Business Administration, 20% of startup businesses failed during their first year, 30% they actually failed during their second year, and 50% within the first 5 years of business. Our next guest is a successful strategist in human behavior. She's also an author, a speaker, aiming to help women and entrepreneurs achieve successful goals in their personal and professional lives. She's also worked in the mental health industry for over 20 years. She has helped over 20,000 people manage and also overcome stress and burnout. And joining us now is licensed professional counselor and author, Dr. Stacia Alexander. And Dr. Stacia, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. I'm glad to be here.
We're glad to have this conversation. I think it comes at a meaningful time because while we are on this other side of the pandemic, all of us will fairly agree, yet and still there's still much work to be done. And when we look, there's some people who in this moment are really still dealing with burnout and stress.
Yes, and it makes sense because so much has changed in the way that we function. And I think people are underestimating that they are experiencing burnout. Like they've never had it to this degree before. So I know a lot of people are shocked and they're trying to push through, but we need to stop and really take a look at what's going on with the workplace setting, with entrepreneurs and employees, even the management. We need to take a look at what's going on.
Yeah, and particularly when we look at management, I think about being a manager. An entrepreneur. An entrepreneur is a manager, a leader, and one who literally is trying to lead a business. When we talk about entrepreneurs, they've had a heavy set of things, and particularly, burdens faced during during the pandemic.
Right. Things have changed, especially economically. A lot of people have had to regroup. And what I tell people is just because you're successful, it doesn't make you immune to the stressors of actually being successful. So we still deal with fears. We still deal with anxiety, depression. A lot more depression was reported in 2020, higher than any other year when it comes to entrepreneurship. And I should say in the last 10 years. But we try to overcome those or look past those experiences because we got to keep up with the day-to-day operations to make sure that those businesses continue to run. So yeah, they're still having some pretty hard experiences on what they're going through.
And so share with me a little bit about your work, because right now I know that you've got a cohort and also you're trying to really deal with this, emotionality concept.
Yes, thank you for asking about that. So I run a program, it's called the Emotionality of Success Strategy Cohort. And I walk women, I only work with women now. I know guys tend to always say, why are you doing that? It's a difference in the energy that people emit when they're in a room. But for right now, I'm working with women and I walk them through the stages of success based on 4 quadrants of life: relationships, professional, self-care, and spiritual. And we really get into the accountability factors of those quadrants in order to help them understand the importance of setting those goals, but also realizing that there is some emotionality behind that, because our goals don't have feelings. Those goals are still sitting out there, but we have some things that we're struggling with on the back end that could, directly impact how successful we are at reaching those goals. So if we deal with the emotionality of it, then we have a greater likelihood of reaching those goals. That's in that program. And for over 23 years, I've been working as a licensed professional counselor in private practice.
So looking at the pandemic right now and looking at our emotionality, what are you seeing as some common trends and themes for people who are really trying to just navigate through this?
Anxiety. There are higher levels of anxiety that people simply did not, like, they don't know what anxiety feels like because they've never had it to this degree. But when you're dealing with the lack of sleep and you're more irritable, you're unable to concentrate. When people call me with those symptoms, then I begin teaching them about what anxiety actually looks like, because we tend to look at it only through the eyes of a full-blown panic attack, when there are several layers to anxiety that could change the way that we function day to day.
Yeah. Anxiety is huge, stress is huge, and it leads to this thing called, burnout. And when I think about going back to entrepreneurs, a lot of the people that we talk to, particularly in small business, really were wondering whether or not their business would ever, float, whether it's going to stay alive, and some unfortunately crashed. But when we look, entrepreneurs really had a lot to deal with. You had the PPP, and some of them never got that. Trying to make ends meet. In this stage of trying to navigate, what do you view as probably some of the best successful tips that you can give for people to navigate as entrepreneurs?
So especially when you're dealing with the burnout, I would tell them to actually set aside some time to recover, like to give them some space uninterrupted where they don't have those obligations to actually rest so that they can restore and recalibrate. I know society tells you that you have to keep digging, but you do need to take a step back. And then you need to be around other people who will hold you accountable for your wellness, like incorporate that into your routine, because as entrepreneurs, a lot of times we'll step back and just go all out 100% trying to make that business work, which means we isolate from those people who would hold us accountable. And the third thing I would suggest is to get help. Like, some people didn't get the PPP loans, but there's other help out there. You may have to, hire other people to do some things that you normally would do without any problems, but now you're having a hard time concentrating. So go ahead and get you some vendors to handle those things to alleviate that pressure that you're under trying to juggle all of the things that are on your plate.
Yeah. And we talk about pressure. A lot of pressure is applied right here. Mental health, really talk about how we can become sharper. Over the course of this past year, it was something that was really put to the back burner. I think we didn't talk enough about mental health, but we are seeing some signs and some symptoms that maybe we didn't pay particular good attention to a lot of people who are dealing with mental health all throughout this pandemic.
Well, Darren, it's not because we didn't try. I mean, we tried to help. We were telling people that this will not, we won't recover from 2020 in 2021. We're going to have long-term impacts from that experience, and people need to understand that. So with mental health, I tell everyone, incorporate a therapist into your wellness routine, just like you do your physician, your optometrist, your dentist. And then I even tell people, you have a stylist, you have someone, a barber that cuts your hair regularly, but you don't have a therapist on your wellness profile. So why is your hairstyle more important than your mental health? Incorporate that into your routine so that it becomes second nature, and you won't understand what it's even like to live without that. So burnout, the stress, trying to maintain, certain lifestyles in spite of this global impact, not just in our households, our communities, but globally, we felt the impact of the pandemic, that we need to get that mental health component in there.
But African Americans and communities of color predominantly were the ones who were most adversely affected throughout the course of this pandemic. There's no question about that. But then when you turn around and you flip it on the other side, when you talk about communities of color and particularly African Americans, there is this stigma in terms of dealing with therapy, mental health wellness, and all of that. Are we finding that those barriers are coming down given the fact of the times that we're living in?
Yes, they are coming down. They're coming down because we're having conversations openly on platforms such as yours. They're coming down because you have more clinicians who are of color, and people will get in those counseling sessions and say, you look like me, like you get it. I don't have to explain these things that we do in our household, or even if I don't have to explain it, I don't have to worry about feeling condemned because of it. And the third thing is that mental health is more accessible now. When I started practicing 23 years ago, there were not very many private practices that were available, and there weren't many private practices that were owned by people of color. Now it's easier to find it. We have national databases where you can type in what you want specifically. You want a Christian, you want a Black woman, you want someone that specializes with depression, you want this insurance carrier. There's all kind of parameters that you can pull up on these databases, and it's more accessible. So they can go into the office or they can do it virtually like you and I are doing.
Yeah. And guess what? If somebody doesn't come, they're going to still deal with it at home. I'm going to give you an opportunity to help somebody at home. I'm stressed. I don't know what to do. How do I deal with this? What do you tell them?
I tell them to take a step back, just take a deep breath. I tell them to understand that what they're experiencing is perfectly normal for what is going on in their life. That their human body is a human body. So we can't expect it to operate at a high level when they're under so much pressure. And then I ask them, what do you want? What is it that you want? What would help you get that peace that you're looking for? So remember, before I talked about accountability, that's what I bring into the counseling sessions. Just helping them navigate what it looks like to get that peace that they're looking for. Because sometimes it's just so much going on in your head, you can't take a step out of the rat race to even come up with any solutions. But having that opportunity to talk and get it out gives you the space to make sense of what you actually need to get that peace in your life.
What's the biggest mistake people are making these days?
Isolating. Isolation. It's isolation. It was forced isolation at the beginning of the pandemic. We've gotten used to not having to deal with people and not having to answer and getting out of the rat race of life. We've gotten used to that. And so that isolation robs us of that human contact. Like, we exchange energy. Every time we're around people, we exchange energy. Hopefully you're around people with positive energy, so that feeds into you. But when you isolate, if you're feeling down, you're just going further and further and further down, and nobody's really around you to say, hey, are you okay? Come on, let's go get something to eat. You know, can I pray for you? Can I call someone for you? Do you need me to bring you something? When you isolate, you don't have those natural things in place to help you stay in a safe space, if you will.
Yeah, yeah. So as we're moving along now, we're talking about business, we're talking about personal, and really trying to navigate both of those right now in a pandemic. What are you finding amongst clients as far as the personal? Because we've been in isolation, and you know, the interpersonal of having to deal with people, as you said, we haven't had to. But a lot of us are coming out, dealing with folk, short-tempered. Our posture is different. Our voice is different. It's a new world.
You called it. You called it. Like, there are some things that are different about us, and we need to acknowledge that. Like, you always hear people say communication is the number one tool you have for relationships. Well, it really is. You need to communicate. Hey, you guys are telling us to come back into the office every day. I don't want to come back into the office. Companies are pulling in mental health, right? And then when you start to get back out, I tell people, pace yourself. Don't try to go back to the same routine, that fast-paced routine that you had before COVID, because you've learned some things about yourself. You realize that rest is good for you. You realize that you do feel better when you have that time to recalibrate. But the other thing, Darren, what we saw in COVID, a lot of people didn't know each other. A lot of people, like couples and families, parents didn't know their kids. They were home with their kids instead of being at school. They realized a lot having to spend more time with them. So we had a lot more family problems that arose during COVID that needs to be addressed. I think we do need to have more programming that highlights how families can recover from going through the quarantine together.
So I'm laughing because I had this conversation with my best friend the other day. I said, man, this COVID thing, people are just finding out who they are.
Right.
I mean, and whether or not we want to be honest, there's this false self, there's this true self, and some people have really come to the knowledge of the true self, and the true self was really the false self.
So, right, part of the Emotionality of Success program is the self-care quadrant. And the subdomain is your self-image. Does it truly align with what you project to other people? And if it doesn't, that's what's going to rob you of your peace. So you're right. During COVID, some people just sat back and realized, I'm not that person. Like, what was I even doing? Like, I feel so much better in the space that I'm in. But again, that's that communication, being open with yourself and being open with the other people, because they may not be ready for who you discovered you truly are.
Right, right. So give us some tips as we start to wind down our time together, but give us some tips really on how to deal with this stress that many people are dealing with silently.
Thank you. So I would say to go ahead and incorporate therapy as a part of your wellness program, like I was saying before. It's like therapy is what you make of it. And if you have been dealing with your stress and your depression and everything by talking to your friends, just think of how much more help you could receive from talking to a skilled clinician. So that's one part of it, therapy. The other part is to give yourself time to rest and recover. You go back out, come back in, give yourself some space to say, okay, this is how I did. I didn't particularly like it. I'm not going to do this anymore. And the third thing is having that accountability person to say, I think you need to take a step back. So you're giving yourself some room to pace yourself, but you also have this person over here who you trust. You're giving them permission to say, I think you need some help, or you're doing a great job. You don't have to be a ship out here alone in the ocean. You need to have those people around you that you trust and who will embrace the authentic you. If you're having a hard time, great. If you're not having a hard time, great. But you do need that in your life.
Yeah. And what do you say to entrepreneurs and those who are in small business right now who literally are, trying to make it and trying to get through this?
They're trying to get through it. I would, you know what, really, Darren, it's the same thing. I tell any entrepreneur, do you have a therapist? Like, of course, I'm a therapist. You think that I'm just going to say everything to them, but it's such a beneficial component to include. But I also tell them to maybe get a solid networking group, a mastermind group, somebody that they can talk to that understands what it means to be an entrepreneur. Because if you're talking to your girlfriend that goes to work every day, her situation is very different. Your guy friend that goes to clock in every day, he gets a direct deposit. His situation is different. He's going to tell you don't have to deal with any of that. When you know in the back of your mind, no, this is it. I'm going to make this work. So then you would get a different energy from somebody who has a business or who has owned a business and would be able to give you some feedback from that direction. So be mindful of who you actually share your frustrations with, because that could go sour real fast.
Yeah. Dr. Stacey Alexander, thank you so much for being with us. Obviously, great conversation, great information. And listen, hopefully we'll have you back.
Thank you. I'd love to come back. I appreciate it.
All right. Dr. Stacey Alexander giving us the latest. And you got to get your mind right. All right. Take a quick break. Be right back with the Social Justice Forum in a minute.
If you're struggling to afford your internet bills during the pandemic, there's a temporary government program that may be able to help. It's called the Emergency Broadband Benefit, and it provides up to $50 monthly discount on your broadband bill to qualifying households. Find more information about the program, including if you qualify and how to enroll, at fcc.gov/broadbandbenefit, or call toll-free at 833-511-0311. That's 833-511-0311.
welcome back to the show. The Miss Foundation for Women is devoted to securing rights, equality, and justice for women. Now, the organization fights to eliminate barriers and fight to secure the same opportunities for all women in the U.S. They work to bring attention to the real challenges facing women, especially women of color, low-income women, and women living in poverty or working from paycheck to paycheck. Here sharing more is the Vice President of Advancement at the Miss Foundation for Women, Ruth McFarland. And Ruth, great to have you.
I'm thrilled to be here. It's really great.
Thank you. So for somebody who does not know literally about the organization, I gave a little bit of an intro, but can you share with us a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, so we've been around now for almost 50 years. And so there's an origin story and there's a today story.
Mm-hmm.
And the origin story is really exciting. It's 4 women came together to found the Ms. Magazine, which at the time in the 70s was a cutting edge national magazine. It was the first magazine that took women's issues really seriously and expanded them beyond the domestic to political and all the other things that women want to think about with respect to their lives and the change that was happening in society at that time around women's rights. And those women were Gloria Steinem, Marlo Thomas, Letty Cotton Pogrebin, and Patricia Carbine. Well, they decided they're going to start a foundation from the Ms. Magazine, and that's how the Ms. Foundation started. And the agenda was really to make sure that resources got to women leading grassroots change across the country in little regions of the country, maybe in little towns, making sure those women got resources and making sure those women got to understand they were part of an ecosystem. And if you go forward now, decades later, it's what the Ms. Foundation is still doing today. The big change, I think, around how we do our work today is that we very explicitly center the lives of women and girls of color. So we talk about addressing issues that affect the lives of women and girls of color and use that gender plus race framework to orient under the feminist umbrella, kind of how we think about making change in the world. We're still making grants. We're still funding first and early and trying to get money to the field, you know, maybe before other foundations and philanthropic groups have really made note of a leader in a particular region. And so this is a very exciting place, certainly for me to be working right now. And at this point in our history, it just feels like the United States is just really ready to have this conversation about gender and racial justice.
Yeah, and I was, really looking at where we are as a country, and we're talking more about, women and equality. We're seeing more and more, from an African American and Asian that's now of Asian descent, who's also now the Vice President of the United States, to seeing many different things that are occurring right now that, if looked several years ago, aren't happening. Much is because of policy, and much is because of advocacy. Talk to me about the policy perspective of your work and how you really look to deal with policy.
Yeah, we support both at the federal and state level policy and legislation that is advancing where women need to be going next, where we need to be looking next to advance our equity. And that's across the sectors of safety, around health, and around economic justice. So when we talk about safety at Ms., we think very broadly. It's, of course, we're really interested in the issues of domestic violence. The Me Too movement is something that we have been very closely aligned with and funding into. Making sure that we're thinking about safety in terms of state-sanctioned violence. So we have funded organizations, for example, started by girls in response to some of what Black girls saw in their schools when school security and police actually were violent to students. And you can remember some of these incidents that we've seen in the news over the last few years. Well, in some cases, it's youth actually that respond to these situations and are raising up these issues. And so we're making sure those make it to the policy and legislative level by supporting and amplifying that. We're also in the economic justice space, thinking about policies that can advance further investment into the efforts and leadership of women and girls, whether that is, and this will really illustrate the breadth of our movement-based, our movement support, whether that's the Equality Act, which is really focused on, advancing opportunity and equity for LGBT folks, or that is the ERA, which is a piece of legislation that's been with us for a very, very long time and still alive, and looks at equity more broadly for women. And so we are, as a national organization, as the oldest national women's fund, we really do have a broad scope in the type of policy advocacy that we are doing. And with the new administration in the White House, it's really, really exciting to have a seat at that table, have a prominent seat at that table, and be able to advise as they are shaping their platform and their agenda around gender.
Yeah, you kind of answered my question, because I know that, previous presidential administration, there was not much by way of equality or conversations. In fact, it was more the degrading of women. Now that we've got new leadership, new political leadership, are you optimistic that a lot will take place in terms of really dealing with the issues concerning women, and more particularly when it comes to that women's pay gap?
Absolutely. I think it's it's on everybody's mind, but it's absolutely part of this administration's agenda. They formed a council that is specifically looking at these issues, and we are part of the advisory board for that council. And it is absolutely part of the agenda of this administration to make sure that when we come out of these 4 years, we've seen not just a repair of some of the things that have been taken apart in the last administration, but also forward movement. And I think I would be remiss in not mentioning, the impact of the pandemic on the economic status and the economic experience of women really can't be understated. I think the pandemic brought to bear some of the gaps that were there all along, right? Some of the issues, some of the fraying or the absence of a social safety net, we really saw those gaps and that fraying result in dire consequences during the pandemic. And I know the administration is focused on that information as well. Yeah, I could talk about that quite a bit. I don't know if you saw it, there was a really great article today released by S&P Global on, it's an economic analysis of the United States, looking at where our economy would be today had we not blocked and challenged the advancement of Black women educationally, in the workforce, et cetera. And what they found was we left $507 billion on the table because of the ways in which we have seen these gaps. And that's just between Black women and white women, right? And of course, there are women of many other types of experience and experiencing challenges as well. So I think as we start to look, I think the administration is focused on this, and others are as well, as we start to look at what does it mean? What do we learn if we look at our economic well-being through this lens of gender and race at the same time? What might we do differently, and how might we be even more successful and stronger as a nation?
Yeah. I want to talk about the pandemic for a moment. And obviously, for you as an organization, what was it like for you being able to still meet up with, those that you're serving and staying connected during a time when we were in severe isolation?
Yeah, it's a great question. It was, even just as a staff, it has been a learning curve. So our offices are based in Brooklyn, but I'm the first executive that's remote. And so I'm based out in Oakland, California. And I was remote before the pandemic. And so it was really interesting to have the rest of my colleagues kind of spread out across the country and begin to come to each other the way we are through these screens. It was interesting. We were in February, right before the pandemic, about to roll out funding called the Activist Collaboration Fund. And the intention of that fund was to really allow leaders and activists on the grassroots level to convene and gather in the way they needed to do. It was an ask we had received, come together how we want to get the work we need to get done. And as we were rolling that out, the pandemic hit, and we had to learn instantly how to turn our grant making into a response to what was happening right now for people. So that really, it was a challenge, but it was an opportunity. And over the course of the last year, we were able to offer that particular fund, 2 more times. It was intended to be a one-time pilot for the year, and we actually did it 3 times last year. And it allowed our program folks to just stay really closely connected to leaders as things changed from day to day, as needs changed from day to day, so that we could remain informed and both help and get resources to the ground, but also elevate those stories up to philanthropy so that the philanthropic sector could remain closely connected and responsive to what was going on.
Hmm. Give me a little bit about immigration. I want to talk about that for a minute as well. Because when we talk about immigration, that was a huge issue in the last presidential administration. It still remains a topic of great challenge and controversy, but I know you're pretty boots on the ground with this issue right here too.
Yeah, we are. And, and it's important that we are, because very frequently the lives and the issues impacting the lives of immigrant women are not those that rise to the surface. They're not the stories that necessarily get told in the media. One of the organizations that we funded for a long time is the Garment Workers Center in Los Angeles. And that is a group, largely immigrant women, who are working in the garment sector and resourcing and this is just one grantee. Right now we support over around 100 organizations, but this is just one story of one grantee and a group of women really focused on making sure that workers' rights are being attended to, but then the lives of those communities are being attended to. So when the pandemic hit, they pivoted from being an advocacy organization to also making sure people got food, to making sure that local lawmakers were aware of the circumstances of those people's lives. And I think that's what's happening across the country. I think of another organization we have funded historically in New York called ADICAR, and they respond to the local community there in Queens to make sure, again, that the needs of these people are being attended to in specificity by local politicians.
And when we talk about immigration, I talk about immigration and rights, and there's also reproductive rights, and that's a battle that continues to be contended with right now. Have you made any progress in that area?
Yeah, I would say a few things. One, it's interesting, it's progress and it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, right? So we know there's a case pending now in front of the Supreme Court that will be a direct challenge to Roe v. Wade. And so we're watching that very, very closely and working to make sure that we rally across the nation, all of the organizations, activists, and other platforms that can get folks really educated about what's at stake here, so that we can make sure that we really raise the voices around that case as it's going through and people are aware of what's at stake. But on the flip side, we, for years now, have done really great work funding as it was sort of emerging, the work of reproductive justice, which goes beyond reproductive rights, but also looks at the lives of parents, the needs of, inclusive of childcare, inclusive of the resources you need to parent well, to make choices about whether or not to have children. And if you choose to have children, how to take good care of them, right? We're currently working on a project in the birth justice space with several close allies in our work. And that will look at funding groups that are really attending to access to maternal health care, care before the birth, care after the birth, and even the more broad space, again, of reproductive justice.
Yeah. What do you want us to know? As an organization, obviously, you do some great work and you continue to do and have your fingers on the pulse of a lot of great things. What is it that you would want our viewers to know about the organization?
I think the thing, we released a really exciting publication last summer that we're still talking about, and we've seen a lot of uptake in the media, called Pocket Change: How Women of Color Are Doing More with Less. And that publication is available on our website. But what it really highlights is, across philanthropy, the investment in leadership of women and girls of color has not been great. It really hasn't. It's been, in fact, embarrassing. And what we found was about 0.5% of all of the philanthropic funds flowing to the field, this was based on 2017 data, about 0.5% ended up going to women and girls of color, organizations led by women and girls of color. And what that comes out to is cents per person, per woman and girl of color, per year. So a coffee, maybe.
Right.
But that's I raised that publication and I raised that issue to say that what I want people to understand is, as we go into this year, into this new summer, after the summer we had last year, and we're reminiscing about where we were last year and the type of social uprising we saw and the concern we saw, especially around racial justice in this country, the issues that got us to that moment took a long time to come together. And the type of the problems that we are addressing today in our country around race and around gender took a long time in the making. And we need to be steadfast and diligent about fixing those problems. It cannot be a 1 year, enthusiasm.
Right, right.
Right? We need to see the 0.5% investment. And I will say that is actually the same in the VC space. So Black women entrepreneurs, same 0.5%. We need to see that go up dramatically. And we need to see a consistent spotlight being shone on the leadership of women and girls of color and a consistent investment in this space.
In other words, a long-term investment.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. For people who want more information, how they get in contact with you?
Well, they can go to our website. It's www.forwomen.org.
All righty. Well, Ruth McFarland, one, thank you so much for being with us here on the Social Justice Forums, and we appreciate your conversation and continue to update us, and we'll update our viewers.
All right. Sounds great. It was good to be with you.
All righty. We are taking a quick break. We encourage you to stay with us. We have more on the Social Justice Forums. We'll be right back in a few.
When taking public transportation, don't touch your phone. Carry hand sanitizer and use it immediately upon leaving the bus or train. Avoid touching your face. If someone is coughing or sneezing, move away. Wash your hands with soap and water as soon as possible. Limit contact with poles. If possible, avoid rush hour. Don't eat or drink on public transportation. Keep your bag off the floor or other surfaces. Avoid directly touching turnstiles. Stay up to date with the latest from your local health department and CDC.
welcome back to the show. Our next guest is a native New Yorker who spent her career serving the people of the West Bronx. As a council member, she currently serves in her second and final terms representing the 16th district of the Bronx. People ask, what is the 16th district? Well, that includes Claremont, Claremont Village, Concourse, Concourse Village, Highbridge, Mount Eden, Morrisania, and Morris Heights communities. She's been a leader in several areas, particularly education, affordable housing, criminal justice reform, public safety issues, and an advocate for alternatives to incarceration, as well as tenant protection and increased training for our police officers. Joining us now, we have the New York City Council member of District 16, Vanessa Gibson. And Councilmember Gibson, good to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me, Darren. I hope you guys are good. Thank you.
We are. And share with us, as we are really moving now out of this COVID crisis a little bit further. We're not out of the woods yet. A lot of people are still concerned about the fact of when we come out, the potential for possibly homelessness and affordable housing. Give us a little bit of your perspective on how you see things.
Yes, thank you so much. So we've worked incredibly hard over the past year when we were first hit with COVID-19, this pandemic that no one knew what it was, and it really turned our worlds upside down. We had heightened food insecurity. We had soaring unemployment. Many of our residents lost their job, their income. Many who are rent burdened were further burdened because they paid over 30% of their income towards rent. And we put a lot of measures in place, both at a local, state, and federal level to prevent evictions from families being forced out of their homes because of non-payment of rent cases. And we try to support homeowners and property owners and really provide a lot of relief to small businesses who also saw their revenue decimated. They had to close their doors. Many of them just struggled to survive. So as we are on the cusp of returning to normalcy and dealing with just COVID recovery, as well as the access to the vaccination, we know that a lot of the moratoriums are eventually going to be lifted. The eviction moratorium that comes to mind that has been put in by the state of New York will expire at the end of August. And we believe that there are a little over 30,000 evictions that are pending in housing court in New York City. And many of those residents we know live in the Bronx. Many of them are on a fixed income. They are families of color, they're immigrant families, and they're older residents. We cannot allow them to be evicted, and communities, we have to do everything we can to provide stability, to keep a roof over their head, and to expand any opportunities that will keep them in their homes. So the eviction moratorium, if we're going to talk about expanding it and extending the time frame, we also need to make sure we promote programs like the rental assistance program that's being offered by the state of New York that provides a level of rental assistance for those families that are behind their rent and face rent arrears.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about the whole COVID-19 pandemic. It's been very much the focus of how we're trying to navigate out of and into a better place. And when we talk about homelessness, then we also talk about food insecurity. I remember one time we had the opportunity to talk to you. You were out there, boots on the ground in the field, really trying to make sure that people got fed. How do you assess the food insecurity in the borough, as well as more particularly in your district?
It's been heartbreaking, Darren. Over the past year, as I've been out, many other elected officials, we work with organizations like Fresh Direct, Common Pantry. We've worked with ICNA Relief. We've worked with Fresh Direct, as I mentioned, and Food Bank and City Harvest, God's Love We Deliver. We work with so many of our community partners to expedite funding in the City Council. We expedited about $25 million last year to many of our food pantry and soup kitchen providers because we saw longer lines. Food has been more expensive at supermarkets because the distributors are charging more for products. And so it's really hard early on to get access to basic food, to healthy food. It was really hard to get cleaning supplies, as you know, and toilet tissue and hand towel and things of that nature. So we've been working with our community partners in giving them the resources they need, programs like EFAP and HIPNAP, which is city and state programs that provide funding for many of our food pantry providers. We've tried to expedite a lot of that money from the city so that we had the ability to address a growing capacity. Longer lines and more families in need, you simply had to do the very best you can. There were organizations like Rural Central Kitchen that were giving out prepared meals, Eat Clean Bro, many organizations on the ground. And even now, a year later, Darren, you wouldn't believe that there are still families in need. We've been talking about universal healthy food. We've been talking about programs like the Fresh program, Health Bucks, making farming and urban agriculture more accessible in our communities, focusing on community gardens and green thumbs, and making sure that we have farmers and green markets all year round, because we fully believe that we have to expand on these existing programs and offer them more in communities that are food deserts, that don't have access to supermarkets and Whole Foods and Trader Joe's and all the other stores that are not accessible in our borough. And we also have to make healthy food reachable and convenient for people. It has to be affordable, because oftentimes it's not affordable. We have to look at programs like the EBT program and SNAP benefits and make sure that those can reach our families, and many of them that have school-age children. The Get Food NYC program that's available at local schools, that's now offering halal and kosher meal options, culturally sensitive meals for families. We have to make sure that we expand on all of that. We've spent millions and millions of dollars, and a lot of that is reimbursable by the federal government, but we know that even a year later, we still have a lot more work to do.
Yeah, a lot of work needs to be done in our community, and obviously, you're right there at the thick of it. I want to talk a little bit more about some of the other things that we deal with in our community, which is police community relations. We know that about this time last year, we were all reeling with the death of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and after, subsequently, of course, we know now the conviction of Derek Chauvin in the death of George Floyd. And before and now, calls for police reform. I know you've been working very hard. You've worked on the Public Safety Committee. Talk to us about, how do you see police reform playing out in a better way?
Last year was a tough year. When we all witnessed the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis last May, it was devastating, because as Black Americans, we have seen far too much violence by police officers across the country. We've heard of the stories of the Eric Garner and, Ahmaud Arbery and Tatiana Jefferson and Breonna Taylor, and so many names that we continuously call out. These are brothers and sisters who have been killed by police violence across the country and right here in our very own city. But I think the murder of George Floyd highlighted the systemic racism that we've been facing for over 400 years in this country. And it really highlighted racism in America. And yes, we have to continue to look at law enforcement in terms of changing the behavior, holding those bad officers accountable that engage in misconduct and excessive use of force. But we also know we have to support law enforcement in the best way we can. We have to support the good officers, the men and women of the NYPD that go to work every day, that don't set out to choke anyone or use excessive force. They just want to return home the same way they left. Just like civilians, we want to return. The gun violence and the plague that we've seen, a 10-year-old killed in Far Rockaway over the weekend, is devastating, and it's not normal. And I've been a part of too many mourning mothers and fathers, too many funerals that I've had to attend and help to facilitate, and it's heartbreaking. We want to launch Safe Summer 2021. We want to have restorative justice, alternatives to incarceration. We want to have police reform. We want to work with our NCOs and our youth coordination officers. We want to make sure that officers are following the rules and the guidelines, but we also know that it's not just police officers that mean safety. We have to look at our neighborhood institutions. We have to look at structure. We have to look at lighting, and we have to look at our corners and make sure that every place is safe for seniors, for elders. People do not feel safe in this city. They have seen crime increasing. There are shootings, stabbings, assaults on Asian Americans and Jewish New Yorkers, and people are very worried about this summer. They're worried about walking down the street in safety and being able to return home safely. And so, yes, we need police officers, but we also need more on anti-gun violence, the Cure Violence program. We need more of our crisis intervention, violence interrupters. We need mediators. We need to deal with the root causes of why young people engage in violence in the first place. Let's talk about jobs and safe spaces and community centers and hubs and programs like Compass, Sonic, Beacon, Cornerstone, after-school programs. Let's talk about mental health and therapeutic services, programs like Saturday Night Lights. We need to get these young people into programs, into trades. They need to be productive, right? They need something to do with their time. And we have to focus on this summer because it's hot. People don't want to be in the house. They want to go to parks. They want to have fun and recreate. And we want them to do that. We just want them to be safe. We have to address the proliferation of illegal handguns in our communities. This is a state of emergency, Darren. This is a national crisis. We need to address it from a healthcare perspective. We need a declaration by President Biden that gun violence is a health crisis, and we need a state of emergency.
Yeah. And give me a little bit about this, because when you talk about what we need stuff, we need more resources pretty much. And we know that there's been that the defund the police movement. Some people say, listen, I'm not for defunding in as much as I'm for reallocating. Where are you on that? And how do you approach that?
Well, last year during the budget, when we had the defund NYPD movement, Black Lives Matter demonstrations across the city, we were able in the adopted budget to transfer $1 billion of expense funding from the NYPD that paid for summer youth and Compass, Sonic, Beacon, Cornerstone programs. It paid for healthcare, social services, but we know that's not enough. Last year's budget was unlike any other I've experienced in my 8 years in the council. We had a $9 billion deficit. We lost $7 billion in revenue due to the pandemic, and we had no money from Albany and no money from the federal government. And we had to make some tough choices. This year is different. The adopted budget in Albany did not cut the city of New York. It gave us more money for education, anti-gun violence initiatives, more program for social services and education and healthcare. And because of the American Rescue Plan, we got $7 billion in New York City over 2 fiscal years that's going to help us address a lot of programs, restoring money to the sanitation, to get 7-day-a-week service, including corner and litter basket pickups, which we desperately need because our streets are not clean the way they could be. We also want to restore money to the Parks Department and get more money for park officers, PEP officers, playground associates. We want more park ambassadors. We want more slots for summer youth this year. We want after school. We want Compass slots, which are middle school daycare slots for our young people in middle school. All of these things we're able to look at now in a real transformative way because we do have more money this year. We're not facing a budget deficit. There will be no talks about layoffs of city workers, which we're grateful for, but we also have to make sure that we put the money where our commitment is. If we want to save young people and give them access and opportunity, we want to provide programs for youth, for seniors, for veterans, for LGBTQIA New Yorkers, for our elders and our veterans, then we have to be about it. We have to demonstrate it through this budget that we're gonna pass in a few weeks. We have to make sure we focus on programs like Single Shepherd, fair student funding, CUNY ASAP. We need to look at our CUNY students as well. Everybody has struggled and been traumatized, Darren. So when you talk about COVID relief and COVID recovery, it is wraparound services for children, families, and all New Yorkers that need it.
Take the time for a minute and share with us. We know that you are a candidate for Bronx Borough President and you are in the run and in the hunt. Talk to us about your decision as to why you decided that you wanted to run for Bronx Borough President.
Well, over a year ago, before the pandemic hit, I knew that I wanted to continue to serve my community in some way. I knew I would be term limited out of the city council at the end of 2021, and I wanted to use my experience on budget. I know how to get things done. I know how to deliver. I know how the city budget works. I've been all over the capital process as well as discretionary process. And I also have 4 years of experience as a state elected official in the New York State Assembly. I'm the only candidate in the race that has state experience and city experience. And I wanted to apply all of that to be the next Bronx Borough President. I want to make sure we have a borough hall for all residents of the Bronx, no matter where you live, no matter what block you represent, what zip code you live in. We want to make sure that we address so many systemic issues that the Bronx historically has faced: underemployment, poverty, lack of access, poor health care, asthma rates through the roof, health disparities, soaring unemployment. We were doing incredible work before the pandemic hit. Our unemployment went down to 6.5%. Thanks to the leadership of Ruben Diaz Jr. and his team. But now we're back in double digits. So our campaign is Forward Together Bronx, and we want to be the leader that will allow the Bronx to emerge from this crisis healthier and stronger than ever before. We want to focus on jobs and economic development, access and opportunity. We want to build economic wealth and power in the Bronx. We want ownership opportunities, affordable housing, access to quality and affordable and low-cost healthcare, and we want to address public education and invest in our students, address the digital divide so that all students have access to community schools and guidance counselors and social workers and nurses, because every child is gifted and talented, and all they need is access because they are our leaders that are ordained for success. And we want to focus on open space, parks and recreation, greening the Bronx. We want to make sure that Bronx residents get everything they rightfully deserve. had an incredible amount of support from labor unions, from DC 37, UFT, CSA, 1199, 32BJ, doctors, teachers, nurses. We've been working very, very much around the clock, talking to voters, knocking on doors, and really reminding them that we know that challenging times are ahead, but we need leaders who are driven, who are dedicated and committed to the cause, who have a plan of action, the passion to get this work done, and really the purpose to serve.
Are you optimistic as we are winding down?
Always, always full of hope, Darren. You have to be full of hope. I've had so much happen to me in my life. The past couple of weeks have been so challenging. I lost my political mother in Aurelia Green, and that broke my heart. And last week, I lost my grandmother to COVID in Trinidad, and I am still standing. I'm still smiling. I'm still praising God because he allows me to wake up every day. And as long as I wake up every day, as long as I have breath in my body, I will serve the residents of the Bronx with every fiber in my being to the very best of my ability.
Vanessa Gibson, thank you so much for being with us, council member. And again, our condolences to you for your loss, and certainly we'll be prayerful for you as well as your family. Talk to you soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Darren, and thank you, BronxNet, for always making sure that you talk to the people and you voice the concerns of the borough of the Bronx. We appreciate you.
Thank you so much. Councilmember Vanessa Gibson here on the Social Justice Forums. And yes, we are out of show. Want to thank you for joining us here on the Social Justice Forums. We want you to join us again next week. We continue to elevate the conversation, have more dialogue, and bring you more of the issues that everyday people facing, and particularly in communities of color, as we highlight a lot of these inequities. I'm Darren Hyman. Thank you for watching the Social Justice Forums. We'll see you next week.